Have you ever met someone who made you question the life you've so carefully built? Blake Harrison had everything a gleaming corner office, headlines that praised him, silence he mistook for peace. But one blind date meant for a friend pulled him into a world he'd spent years avoiding, one filled with warmth, chaos, vulnerability, and a woman who wasn't anything like he expected. Ava Monroe didn't come from privilege. She came from heart, and when their worlds collided, his polished and protected, hers messy and meaningful, both were forced to confront the question we all avoid. What do we lose when we live behind walls that keep us safe, but also keep us alone? Would you risk your reputation to protect someone who reminded you what it means to feel again? Would you choose love if it meant giving up control? This isn't a story about perfection. It's a story about choice, about what happens when two very different people stop running from their pain and decide to build something honest in a world that doesn't always reward it. If you've ever loved, lost, or longed to believe in second chances, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join us on this emotional journey. Let's begin. The cold wind rattled the windows of Blake Harrison's office on the 49th floor of Harrison Technologies. Outside, Manhattan was fading into dusk, the city lights flickering like distant stars trying to outshine the gray sky. Inside, the room was quiet, save for the ticking of an antique wall clock, a gift from his late wife that had outlived her by nearly a decade. Blake sat alone, shoulders squared, gaze fixed on the screen in front of him. But he wasn't reading the quarterly report. He hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. The vibration of his phone broke the silence. Connor Davis. It read. Blake hesitated. He knew that tone, the kind of call that began with laughter and ended with trouble. With a sigh, he picked it up. Blake! Connor's voice boomed, casual and chaotic as ever. Tell me you're not still in the office. It's 5:30, Blake replied dryly. Where else would I be? Connor chuckled. Exactly the problem. You've become a fossil. My friend, you need to get out. Blake leaned back in his chair. And I'm guessing you've called to fix that sharp as ever. Connor said, Look, there's this dinner tonight. I'm seeing someone. Her friend's tagging along. Total setup. But I promised I'd bring a +1. Blake's eyes narrowed. No, you haven't even heard. No, you owe me one. I owe you 100, and I've repaid 99. Connor laughed. This is the 100th. Blake looked toward the window, watching snow begin to drift against the glass. I'm not in the mood for blind dates. It's not a date, Connor said quickly. It's dinner. 4 adults sharing a meal. You eat, you leave. I just need someone who can hold a conversation and not scare off my future girlfriend's roommate. Blake's silence stretched long enough for Connor to push. She's normal. Teaches kids, I think. Not your usual type. But maybe that's a good thing. The mention of usual type made Blake wince. He didn't have a type anymore. He hadn't since Savannah died. Connor softened his voice. Blake, it's one evening. You sit across from someone nice. You don't have to marry her. I've got a quarterly earnings call at 7 a.m. Then all the more reason to enjoy tonight. Recharge your social battery. Blake exhaled through his nose, then looked at the framed photo on his desk. Savannah, smiling in the summer sun, hair tangled by the wind. It had been 8 years since the accident, since the world stopped feeling personal. Where and when he said, finally. Connor whooped. Eloria. 7 o'clock. Dressed like a human. Not a funeral. See you there. Blake hung up, the screen fading to black. He looked around the office orderly, polished, sterile. His world was clean and precise, just like he liked it. But even he had to admit, it had been a long time since he sat across from someone and truly talked. He stood, stretched, and reached for his coat. At 6:50 p. Blake stepped out of a black Lincoln Navigator and onto the salted sidewalk outside Aloria. Snow drifted lazily from the sky, coating the world in a quiet kind of stillness. The restaurant's golden light spilled onto the street, casting warmth into the wintry evening. He adjusted his collar, ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, and approached the door. Then he saw her. Half a block away, a young woman stood next to a yellow cab, arguing with the driver. Her coat was worn at the edges, her hair tucked into a loose bun that had mostly unraveled. Her voice, though firm, carried a note of desperation. "I gave you a 20, she said. "The fare was 12. You owe me change." "That was a 5, the cabbie replied, already climbing back into the car. "No, it wasn't, please. I need the rest." The cabbie slammed his door and began to pull away. Before Blake realized what he was doing, his feet were already moving. "Hey," he called, his voice slicing through the cold air. The cab stopped. The driver looked out, annoyed. "What?" Blake stepped up, pulled a $50 bill from his wallet, and handed it through the window. "Consider it settled." The cabbie took the money, mumbled a thanks, and drove off. The woman turned to him, stunned. "You didn't have to do that." Blake shrugged. "Seemed like the right thing. I'll pay you back." "That's not necessary." She offered a gloved hand. "Ava. Ava Monroe." He shook it, surprised by the warmth in her grip. "Blake." Her eyes searched his. Kind eyes, amber brown, with a flicker of guarded gratitude. "Are you headed to Aloria?" "I am." She laughed, a small breath in the winter air. "Me too." "Blind date?" Blake raised an eyebrow. "Connor." She nodded. "Vanessa's idea. I was going to cancel, but she wouldn't let me." Blake smiled, something loosening inside him. "Then I guess we're both being dragged into this." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the snow disappeared. The noise, the cold, the expectations, all of it faded. There was only her, standing in the quiet hush of the city, like something out of a life he'd almost forgotten how to want. "Shall we?" he said, holding the door open. Ava hesitated, then stepped through. And just like that, the evening began. Inside Aloria, the hum of conversation mingled with soft jazz. The lighting was warm but subdued, casting a golden glow over linen-covered tables and crystal glassware. It was a place designed to impress upscale, refined, and decidedly out of place for someone like Ava Monroe. She paused just inside the door, brushing snowflakes from her shoulders and looking around as though unsure she belonged. Blake noticed. "You okay?" Ava gave a half smile, adjusting the strap on her worn purse. "Yeah, just, I don't usually eat at places with waiters in tuxedos and more than one kind of fork." Blake offered a gentle smile. "Pick whichever fork you like best. I won't judge." She laughed, the sound low and honest. "Deal." A maitre d' appeared and led them to a corner table near a frosted window. Ava took it all in: the heavy silverware, the sparkling glasses, the people around them dressed in designer confidence. She tugged self-consciously at the sleeve of her coat, which had a tiny tear near the wrist. Blake watched her, then quietly removed his own overcoat, revealing a charcoal gray suit with effortless elegance. But there was no arrogance in him, only observation, and perhaps something softer, something like concern. "I'm guessing Vanessa told you nothing about me," he said once they were seated. Ava grinned. "She said you were Connor's workaholic friend who needed to get out of the cave." Blake chuckled, genuinely amused. accurate. She also failed to mention how lovely her friend is. Ava blushed, then rolled her eyes. She left out a lot of things, like the fact that I'd be sitting across from someone who clearly belongs here. And you think you don't. I teach second grade in Brooklyn. My idea of fancy dining is grabbing a slice from Luigi's and eating it before the cheese hardens. He leaned forward slightly. I think that sounds perfect. She studied him then, her amber eyes narrowing in amused suspicion. Are you always this good at saying the right thing? I'm actually very out of practice. Their server arrived, taking orders and pouring a deep red wine Blake recommended. Ava took a sip, closed her eyes briefly, and smiled. That's incredible. I usually just grab the cheapest bottle on sale and call it a night. He laughed again twice in one evening, a personal record in recent years. Ava set her glass down carefully. You're not what I expected. Neither are you. The words lingered in the air, tender but honest. Their appetizers arrived. Blake had ordered seared scallops. Ava, unsure, had gone with a garden salad. She poked at a cherry tomato with quiet amusement. So, she said between bites, what is it exactly that you do, besides rescuing women from grumpy cab drivers? Blake hesitated, then replied, I run a tech firm, Harrison Technologies. Her eyes widened. Wait, the Harrison Technologies. He nodded, sipping his wine. I've seen that logo on half the tablets in my classroom. He smiled. We've partnered with a few education programs. Now I really feel underdressed. You're not, he said simply. You're real. That's rare. A pause. Do you like what you do? She asked. Another pause. Longer this time. I used to, he said finally. Now? I'm not sure. It keeps the lights on. Gives me control, safety. Ava nodded slowly, but not meaning. He looked at her, surprised by how quickly she'd gotten to the heart of it. No, he admitted. Not lately. She leaned back, thoughtful. I know that feeling. I used to work at a charter school with almost no funding. Hard days, exhausting weeks. But the kids kept me going. Now, it's better resources, support. But sometimes I miss the rawness, the grit, that sense of mattering. Blake felt something tighten in his chest. It had been years since someone spoke to him like this honestly, without agenda. Your students are lucky, he said. Ava looked down at her plate. I'm the lucky one. For a while, they talked about books, about favorite teachers, about childhood dreams that had changed shape over time. Blake found himself smiling more than he had in months. Ava, too, seemed to soften less on guard, more herself. Then Blake's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, a message from Connor. Running late. Keep her company. He slid the phone face down on the table. Everything okay? Ava asked. Just Connor. Apparently, we've been abandoned. She raised an eyebrow. So this was a setup. Looks like it. Should we be offended or flattered? He considered, mildly flattered. They clearly think we're compatible. Ava laughed. They also think adding strangers to a romantic equation is a good idea. Blake nodded, then added, maybe sometimes strangers surprise you. Their entrees arrived, her roasted chicken. His ribeye and conversation turned to lighter things. Family stories, holiday traditions, bad dates. Ava shared a story about a disastrous online date involving a man who brought his parrot along because she got separation anxiety. Blake nearly choked on his wine. As the meal wound down, the snow outside thickened. The city blurred behind the window, glowing softly like a memory you almost forgot you had. Ava stared out at the street. It's beautiful. I love snow, how it hushes everything. Blake followed her gaze, then looked at her instead. So do I. When the check came, she reached for her purse. He shook his head. I insist. She hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but next time, I get the pizza. Blake smiled. Deal. They walked out together into the quiet cold, coats buttoned, breath visible in the air. For a moment, neither of them moved. Thank you, she said. For dinner. For not being a jerk. He looked at her, the streetlight casting a soft halo over her hair. Thank you for making me feel human again. Something passed between them unspoken, uncertain, but undeniably real. I can get a cab, she said. I'll drive you. Aren't you headed the other way? I don't mind. She looked at him, measuring, then nodded, and as they walked toward the car, the snow falling all around them, something inside both of them quietly shifted. They didn't know it yet, but that night had already changed everything. Back in the warmth of Blake's Lincoln Navigator, Ava settled into the passenger seat with a soft sigh, brushing melting snowflakes from her coat. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar, pristine and almost too perfect. She glanced around, trying not to look impressed. This is a very quiet car, she murmured. Blake gave a faint smile. Soundproofed. Helps me think. Ava nodded, watching the city pass through the tinted windows. Sometimes I like noise. The chatter of kids, the sound of the heater kicking on, even traffic, feels alive. Blake glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. As they drove through Midtown, conversation turned to the little things, books they loved, foods they hated, memories of growing up Ava in a small town in Vermont, Blake on the Upper East Side with parents who traveled more than they stayed. You had a nanny, she asked, half joking. I had 4, he replied. Each lasted about a year. My grandfather was the one constant. And what was he like? Brilliant, Blake said. And cold. He built the company from nothing after the war, believed in efficiency, discipline. Emotion was a distraction. Ava turned slightly in her seat. Do you believe that I used to? He said quietly. She didn't push. Instead, she offered, my dad's a mechanic. Taught me how to change a tire before I could ride a bike. Blake smiled. I've never changed a tire in my life. Ava laughed. Then you haven't lived. They reached her apartment building in Brooklyn, a narrow walk-up with cracked steps and a crooked mailbox. You don't have to walk me up, she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. I want to. She hesitated, then nodded. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and distant curry. Ava didn't apologize for it. She didn't have to. Blake followed her up 3 flights in silence, the air between them filled with something neither could name. At her door, she turned. Well, this is me. He looked at the peeling paint, then back at her. You deserve more. I have everything I need. He studied her face, the calm in her, the steadiness. It disarmed him more than glamour ever had. I'd like to see you again, he said, surprising himself. Ava tilted her head. You're sure, very. She smiled. Then okay. They stood there for a moment. Blake, with all his suits and silence. Ava, in her thrift store coat and unwavering honesty. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and frowned. Vanessa. She's asking how it went. Blake chuckled. And what are you going to tell her, that you weren't as intimidating as advertised? His smile softened. I'll take that as a win. She stepped inside and closed the door with a quiet click, leaving Blake standing in the hallway. 3 days later, Blake sat in his office, staring out at a rain-slicked Manhattan. The city was gray, its usual hum muted by low clouds. His assistant tapped lightly on the glass wall. "Sir, the design team is ready for your feedback. Tell them I'll be 5 minutes." When she left, he turned back to the photo on his desk. Savannah, again, blonde, elegant, perfect. Her absence still echoed, but the ache had dulled into something quieter. He picked up his phone and typed, "Dinner this week. Your pick. Anywhere with loud kids or terrible pizza." Sent. 2 minutes later, Ava replied, "Deal. But you're buying again. I'll bring coupons." Blake smiled. That Friday, they met at a noisy little diner called Penny's Grill, filled with families and college students. The walls were covered in old photographs and handwritten menu boards. Ava slid into the booth wearing a hoodie and jeans. Blake had left the tie at home, opting for a navy sweater and dark slacks. "You clean up casually," she teased. He shrugged. "I'm trying to blend." A waitress appeared, dropped off water, and gave them 2 menus. Ava pointed at the chalkboard. "Get the meatloaf. It's better than it sounds." Blake raised an eyebrow. "You trust food from a place that advertises mystery meat. It builds character." He ordered the meatloaf. She ordered a root beer float and pancakes. At 7 in the evening, "You eat breakfast at night?" he asked. "Breakfast is always appropriate." They laughed, talked, shared slices of life in messy, uneven pieces. At one point, Blake glanced around the diner and said, "This feels more real than most boardrooms I sit in." Ava nodded. "That's because it is." Then, out of nowhere, she asked, "Why do you think your friends wanted to set you up?" Blake blinked. "I suppose they think I've been alone too long." "And have you?" "Yes," he admitted. Ava stirred her straw slowly, thoughtful. "Me too. But alone is easier. Safe." Blake looked at her. "But lonely." She nodded, not looking at him. "Yeah." Their eyes met across the table. The clink of silverware, the chatter of families, the faint sound of an old jukebox all faded. Just them. Just this moment. Then Blake's phone buzzed. He glanced down. Marissa Delaney. He didn't answer. Just turned the phone over, screen down. Ava saw, but said nothing. The moment shifted, just slightly. As they walked out, snow began to fall again, softer this time. The sidewalk glowed under the street lights. Ava slipped her hands into her coat pockets. "Thank you for the meatloaf. Thank you for not judging me for ordering it." She laughed. "Would you want to do this again?" Blake asked. "I'd like that." They stood under a flickering street lamp, the snow dusting their shoulders. No kiss, no promises, just something unspoken, something waiting. Sunday morning in Manhattan was unusually quiet, the kind of morning when even the city seemed to sleep a little longer, wrapped in gray clouds and the hush of weekend stillness. Blake Harrison sat at his kitchen counter, a mug of black coffee in hand. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him revealed Central Park, dusted in white. From here, everything looked peaceful. But inside, he was restless. He had barely slept. It wasn't insomnia or business anxieties that kept him awake this time. It was Ava, not her face exactly, or her laugh, or the way she quoted her students like philosophers. It was the way she made him feel unprotected. For years, Blake had lived in a fortress, built of routines, logic, restraint. Ava had walked right in, without knocking. He rubbed his thumb against the edge of the coffee mug, staring out at the frozen park below. Then his phone buzzed again. Marissa Delaney. Again. He ignored it. There had been a time when Marissa could command his attention with a glance. Now, her persistence felt like static, irritating, relentless, and impossible to ignore forever. He set the phone aside and opened his email. 43 unread messages. Most could wait. Then, a new subject line appeared. Brooklyn Elementary Grant Proposal from Ava Monroe. Curious. Blake clicked. The email was brief, thoughtful. She explained a small funding gap in her classroom's reading program, $3,500 for updated materials and storytelling kits. She didn't ask for money, only if he might know someone who could help. No assumptions. No pressure. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed 3 words, "I'll handle it." He didn't hit send. Not yet. Instead, he saved the draft and walked out onto his balcony, the cold air biting his face. Somewhere below, kids were tossing snowballs. Life went on, ordinary, beautiful. And somewhere in Brooklyn, Ava was probably grading spelling tests with a blanket on her lap and a cup of tea she'd reheated twice. Blake stood there for a long time, alone in the wind. That evening, they met at a gallery in Soho. Ava had been invited by one of her students' parents and had extended the offer to Blake. He'd said yes without thinking. Now, surrounded by modern art and people in turtlenecks discussing brushstrokes, Blake found himself oddly out of place not because of the art, but because he wasn't used to saying yes to someone else's world. Ava arrived in a forest green coat, cheeks pink from the cold. "I can't believe you came," she said. "Surprised. You invited me," Blake replied, offering a small smile. She grinned. "Still, you're kind of a big deal. These events are more my territory. Budget wine, polite clapping, kids running around with juice boxes. I like polite clapping." They walked slowly through the gallery, pausing in front of a canvas splashed with erratic blues and crimson. "What do you see?" Ava asked. Blake tilted his head. "Chaos. Freedom," she countered. He glanced at her, amused. "We may be looking at the same thing, but we're definitely not seeing it the same way." "Exactly," she said, her eyes twinkling. Later, as the crowd thinned and the wine lost its chill, Blake found himself watching her more than the art. The way she tilted her head when she listened. The way she touched people gently on the arm when she laughed. She belonged here. Not in his world of numbers and negotiations, but in this world warm, unpredictable, alive. That realization twisted in his chest. After the event, they walked down the cobblestone street, snow crunching beneath their feet. "Can I ask you something?" Ava said, her voice quiet. "Of course." "Why me?" He blinked. "What do you mean?" "You could be with anyone. Someone who fits into your life better. Someone who's less likely to forget which fork is which." Blake stopped walking, looked at her. "Because with you, I don't have to pretend." Ava held his gaze. "But will that always be enough?" The question landed hard. Not an accusation, just truth wrapped in softness. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'd like to find out." She nodded, her breath visible in the cold air. Then she smiled, not entirely confident, but sincere. "Me too." Back in his penthouse, alone again. Blake found himself standing in the middle of his living room, staring at nothing. He had everything. And yet, the silence pressed heavier tonight. He poured himself a scotch and walked toward the fireplace, where an old photo of Savannah still stood. Her eyes sparkled in the frame, frozen in a time when he still believed love made sense. He whispered, barely audible, "I think I'm falling for someone." And for the first time in years, he didn't feel guilty saying it. Monday came with a quiet heaviness. It was one of those New York mornings when the sky looked like wet cement and people hurried along the sidewalks as if trying to outrun something invisible. Blake Harrison stood at the glass wall of the executive boardroom on the 48th floor, his gaze distant, unfocused. Behind him, voices droned on talk of margins, deadlines, market forecasts. He didn't hear any of it. His thoughts kept returning to Ava and, uninvited, to Marissa Delaney. It started as a flicker, a name, a few texts. Then came the phone call. He hadn't answered. He couldn't. But the past had a way of finding its own doors. Mr. Harrison Blake turned. His CFO looked at him expectantly. "Your thoughts on the projection?" Blake adjusted his tie. "It's aggressive. I want a 10% buffer on R&D, especially if we're courting government contracts." The CFO nodded, satisfied. The meeting resumed. But Blake's thoughts had already slipped back to 3 years ago. Back when Marissa had still been a permanent fixture in his world, charming, sharp, impeccably connected. She understood his lifestyle, could navigate gala halls and power lunches like a second skin. She'd been with him when Savannah's memory was still fresh and raw, offering companionship without depth. It had worked, until it didn't. She wanted more. He didn't. He ended it cleanly, or so he thought. That evening, Blake arrived home later than usual. The lights of the penthouse greeted him, soft and impersonal. He poured himself a bourbon and leaned against the kitchen island. The scotch from 2 nights ago still lingered in the air. He pulled out his phone and stared at the unsent email to Ava. Still in drafts. Why hadn't he sent it? 3 simple words. "I'll handle it." But something had stopped him. Not because he didn't want to help, but because a part of him feared what it meant to say yes to her world. To really say yes. He deleted the draft, and instead, he called his assistant, Margot, have accounting set aside $3,500 for an anonymous grant to Brooklyn Elementary for their reading program. "Yes, sir. And make sure Ava Monroe never finds out it was me." Margot paused. "Of course." Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, Ava sat cross-legged on her couch, papers spread out around her like fallen leaves. She was grading writing assignments. One child had written a story about a superhero made of pancakes. Another had drawn a comic strip about a lonely dog who found a family. Ava smiled softly, but her mind wasn't on the stories. It was on him. Blake had been distant the last 2 days, not unkind, just quieter. She knew better than to overthink. People had their rhythms. But the doubt had started creeping in. Not just about him, but about herself. Could she really fit into his world? Not just the wealth or status, but the grief, the history, the shadows. She looked around her apartment, the chipped coffee table, the bookshelf sagging under the weight of too many donated books, the kitchen sink that needed a plumber. Then she thought about Blake's home. Everything in place, immaculate. Still, almost too still. She'd stood in his living room once, and though the view was breathtaking, she'd felt a chill, not from the temperature but from the absence of life. She didn't want to be someone's visitor in their life. She wanted to belong. The next morning, Blake received an envelope on his desk, no name, just his initials, handwritten in black ink. Inside, a photograph, a grainy image, him and Ava. Outside the gallery in Soho, her smiling, him looking at her, and a note. She's not just charming, she's valuable. $5 million to keep your privacy intact. Blake's stomach dropped. He reread the note, pulse rising. His instincts kicked in, sharp, cold, calculating. Who took the photo? Who knew they were there? Who knew enough to threaten her? Through him, his mind flashed Marissa. Only a few people still had access to his inner circle. Fewer still would dare such a move. He clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a threat to his privacy. It was a threat to Ava's peace. And that made it personal. That night, he didn't sleep. He stood on the terrace, coat open, snow settling on his shoulders. Below, the city pulsed, lights flickering, cabs passing, a world that never stopped. He didn't tell Ava. Not yet. He needed time, a plan, a way to protect her without drawing her further in. But it was too late for distance. He was already in too deep. And if the past had come to test him, he was ready to fight back. It started with a single text message. Touching scene in Soho. The press will love it. $5 million or it goes public. Your move. Blake stared at the screen. His jaw clenched so tightly. The muscle ticked. Not for the first time in his life. He felt like a man being pulled in two directions, protect the company or protect her. But this time, it wasn't business. It was personal. He tapped a message to Reynolds, his head of private security. We've got a situation. Meet me at the office. 1 hour. Later that night, inside a dimly lit conference room in Harrison Technologies, Blake handed Reynolds the photo and the note. The former cop reviewed it with calm precision, his expression unreadable. We've dealt with threats before, Reynolds said, but this one's different. I know, Blake said. It's not about stock prices or competitors. It's about Ava. You think this came from someone you know? Blake nodded. Marissa Delaney. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. The ex. She's desperate, and she knows how to weaponize timing. Reynolds folded the photo and slid it into a secure envelope. I'll dig. Quietly. Do it fast, Blake said. If she leaks this, it's not just headlines. Ava becomes a target. 2 days passed. Blake didn't see Ava. He didn't call either. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was trying to protect her. That was the narrative he told himself. But the truth was more complicated. Blake didn't know how to talk to her about this. About blackmail. About what it meant to live in a world where every kindness could be twisted, every moment made into leverage. So instead, he watched the city, attended meetings, gave interviews, and in every silent moment, he thought of Ava. Ava, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the shift. At first, she chalked it up to Blake's work. She knew he had deadlines, meetings, more pressure than she could understand. But as the days passed and the space between his replies grew longer, she couldn't ignore the ache. She didn't want to be needy. She wasn't that kind of woman. But being forgotten, that stung. Her roommate Vanessa noticed. He's probably just busy. Ava nodded, trying to believe it. But in the quiet of her bedroom that night, she stared at the ceiling and wondered if she'd been foolish to think she could matter to someone like Blake Harrison. The next afternoon, Reynolds returned with answers. Blake sat across from him in his office, hands steepled. She followed you, Reynolds said flatly. That night in Soho. From the gallery to Ava's place, Marissa Reynolds nodded. She hired a freelance paparazzo to get the shot. Then she used a burner phone to send the message. Blake exhaled slowly. Is she bluffing? No, Reynolds replied. But she's also vulnerable. She's in financial trouble, bad investments, legal issues with her last client. We can squeeze her. I don't want her squeezed, Blake said, surprising even himself. I want her out of our lives. That'll take leverage. Blake stood, walked to the window, and stared at the city that had taught him every ruthless rule he knew. Find it. That evening, Blake finally called Ava. She answered on the third ring. Hi, she said softly. Hi. There was a pause. Then she added, I was starting to wonder if I'd imagined how well we got along. Blake closed his eyes. Her voice hit like warmth in the cold. You didn't imagine it, he said. I'm sorry for the silence. Something came up. Something bad. He hesitated. Complicated. Ava didn't press, but her voice cooled slightly. Are we still doing this? Or was that just a dinner or two? Blake felt something tighten in his chest. This is real, Ava. And because it's real, I want to be honest. I'm not just some guy who owns a company. My life, it's watched, tracked, and now someone's trying to use you to get to me. A long silence. Then, quietly, me. They took photos, sent threats. They want money to keep it quiet. Ava's breath caught. But we didn't do anything. That doesn't matter to people who see dollar signs. Why didn't you tell me I didn't want to drag you into it? A beat passed. Then another. You dragged me in the moment you asked me to dinner. He had no answer. I'm not a porcelain doll. Blake, she continued, voice trembling but steady. I've seen struggle. I've paid rent late. I've taught hungry kids how to read. I can handle pressure. But what I can't handle is being a secret. Blake's throat tightened. I'm not ashamed of you, Ava. Then act like it. And with that, she ended the call. Back in her apartment, Ava stared at the phone in her hand. Her heart was pounding. She wasn't angry, she was hurt. She had let herself believe something rare was growing between them. But now, the doubt was louder than hope. Outside, snow began to fall again. She didn't move. At that same moment, across the city, Blake stood alone in his penthouse. The scotch burned his throat, not because it was strong, but because she was right. He had asked her into his life, but only let her into the parts that didn't challenge his armor. And now, it was cracking wide open, not from weakness, but from something terrifyingly unfamiliar. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. Blake Harrison stood with his hands in his coat pockets, staring at the numbers as they lit up one by one. Floor 10, floor 11, floor 12. By the time he reached Ava Monroe's floor, he still didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he had to say something. The hallway was quiet, dimly lit, with the familiar smell of old linoleum and distant curry. He'd been here only a few times, yet it felt more personal than any of the mansions he'd walked through in his life. He paused in front of her door, raised his hand, hesitated, then knocked. The door opened a crack, chains still fastened. Ava's eyes met his, guarded, tired. I shouldn't have come without calling, he said quietly. She didn't respond at first. Then slowly, she closed the door just long enough to undo the chain and opened it again. You've got 5 minutes, she said, stepping back. He entered, and the warmth of her apartment hit him harder than the radiator ever could. Books stacked on shelves, soft lamplight, the faint smell of vanilla and old paper. It was humble, but it was hers. Ava crossed her arms. Well, I came to apologize. For what, exactly? For keeping you in the dark, for making you feel like a side note in my life. You're not. Ava looked at him carefully. Then why did you act like I was Blake? Inhaled, deep and slow. Because I was scared. She raised an eyebrow. Of what? Of losing control. Of letting someone see all the things I keep hidden behind suits and success. You're not like anyone I've ever known. Ava, you make things feel real. She softened slightly, but didn't move. He continued. I built a life where nothing could touch me. Then you walked in and reminded me that safety isn't the same as living. She let out a small breath, her shoulders lowering. I never asked you to change your life for me, Blake. I just wanted to be seen. You are, he said, more clearly than anyone else. They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them thick with truth. Then Ava turned away, walking to the window where snow had started to gather on the sill. I've spent most of my life trying not to take up too much space, she said. I know what it's like to feel like an afterthought. I promised myself I wouldn't go back to that. Blake stepped closer, not touching her, and I promised myself I'd never let anyone close enough to break me again. Looks like we both broke our promises, she whispered. He nodded. Maybe that's a good thing. Ava turned to face him. Her expression was still cautious, but her eyes had softened. You said someone threatened you because of me. They tried to. They failed. What if it happens again? Blake paused, then spoke with rare clarity. Then we face it. Together. Later that night, after she'd finally allowed herself to believe him, at least a little, Ava sat on her small couch while Blake brewed tea in her cramped kitchen. He looked entirely out of place in her world, too tall for the cabinets, too graceful for the chipped mugs. Yet somehow, the sight of him moving gently, carefully like he didn't want to disturb the soul of the space made something shift inside her. He brought her the tea, his hands steady. I've been thinking, he said, sitting beside her. That sounds dangerous, he chuckled. It is. I want to take you somewhere. Ava raised an eyebrow. That's vague. It's a fundraiser. For a children's literacy program. Her eyes lit up, just slightly. Is it? Fancy. He hesitated. It's at the Met, Ava groaned, dropping her head back against the couch. Blake. I know, he said quickly. But your school is one of the benefactors, and they're recognizing you. What he pulled out a printed invitation. Her name was there. Ava Monroe, honored guest. They didn't tell me. They wanted it to be a surprise. I may have nudged them. She stared at the paper, then at him. You're impossible, but thoughtful, he offered with a small smile. She looked at the invitation again, overwhelmed. I don't have anything to wear. You don't need anything. I'm not going to show up at the Met in my good jeans. I can help. Ava shot him a look. Don't say you'll buy me a dress. Blake held up his hands. Okay, I won't. She stared at him, lips twitching. But maybe. Vanessa might have something buried in the back of her fashion emergency closet. He grinned. A diplomatic solution. They sat quietly for a while, sipping tea as snow fell gently outside, and for the first time in a long time. Blake felt like he belonged somewhere he hadn't built himself. The next day, back in his office, Blake stood by the window once more. But this time, he wasn't looking at the skyline. He was thinking about choice, the kind that isn't loud or dramatic, the kind that happens quietly, in the spaces between fear and love. He chose her, not because she needed saving, but because she saw him before he even remembered how to look at himself. The steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art glowed under soft golden lights, framed by snow-dusted evergreens and velvet ropes. Guests in floor-length gowns and tailored tuxedos ascended the grand staircase as though entering another world. Blake Harrison adjusted the cuffs of his black tuxedo and glanced toward the arriving guests, but his gaze wasn't on them. It was on the glass doors. And then he saw her, Ava Monroe, standing at the top of the steps, wrapped in a borrowed black evening coat. Her dress, a simple midnight blue gown with delicate embroidery, hugged her softly but modestly. Her hair was pinned up, a few wisps escaping around her cheeks. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't trying, but she was radiant. Blake forgot to breathe. Ava stepped toward him slowly, nervous but composed. Vanessa came through. She said, half joking, smoothing the fabric. He offered her his arm. The tragedy would have been if you hadn't worn it. She gave a breathless laugh, then whispered, "Everyone's staring." "They're staring at you," he said. "You outshine all of them." Ava rolled her eyes, but her fingers tightened gently around his arm. Inside, the museum had been transformed. Tall floral arrangements towered over silk-covered tables, and a jazz quartet played quietly near the marble fountain. Waiters moved like choreography, passing flutes of champagne to New York's most powerful faces. Blake introduced Ava to board members, politicians, tech giants. She shook every hand with quiet confidence, answering questions about literacy with ease, her passion unmistakable. "She's delightful," whispered Roberta Langston, one of the foundation's oldest and most respected patrons, leaning toward Blake during dinner, "and refreshingly genuine." "Where have you been hiding her?" "We recently met," Blake replied simply. Roberta smiled. "Well, hold on to her. She makes you look human." Blake's smile faltered slightly. Human. It was the truth, spoken like a joke, across the table. Ava laughed at something one of the donors said. Her laughter was soft, but full real. She belonged here more than most. After dinner, the room dimmed slightly as a host stepped up to the podium. "Tonight," she said, "we recognize a teacher who has brought not only innovation but heart into our city's classrooms. Please welcome Ms. Ava Monroe from Brooklyn Elementary." Ava froze mid-conversation, her wine glass halfway to her lips. "What?" she whispered, turning toward Blake. He leaned in. Quietly. "Surprise." She looked panicked. "No one told me I was going to speak." "You'll be great." Before she could protest, applause erupted. All eyes turned toward her. She stood slowly, her face pale but composed. Blake watched her walk toward the stage, small, measured steps. Her hands trembled slightly. At the podium, she hesitated. Then, her eyes found his in the crowd. Blake nodded once. Steady. Ava took a breath. "Thank you," she began. I didn't prepare a speech, because I didn't know I'd be speaking. Laughter, gentle, but I do know what I want to say." She spoke of her students, of early mornings and late nights, of kids who struggled to read until the moment something clicked. She spoke of how stories became bridges, how literacy gave children power they never knew they had, and how sometimes, in the middle of everything you think is broken, a book can offer a kind of hope. As she spoke, Blake felt something shift deep in his chest. Not pride, not admiration, love. It was that clear. When she returned to the table, cheeks flushed, hands still trembling, he took her hand under the table and didn't let go. They stepped outside later than planned. The night had deepened, the snow thickening. The city glowed beneath a quiet blanket of white. Blake handed his coat to the valet, his fingers brushing hers. She smiled up at him. "I still can't believe they did that," she whispered. "You were extraordinary." She laughed softly. "I think I blacked out halfway through." He was about to reply when a voice called out behind them. "Well, well, if it isn't Manhattan's most elusive bachelor." Blake turned, his jaw clenched instantly. Marissa Delaney, in a crimson dress that glittered like ice, walked toward them with a practiced smile. Ava stiffened. "Marissa," Blake said, his tone cool. Marissa's eyes swept over Ava, assessing, calculating. "I see you found yourself a new cause." Ava narrowed her eyes. "And you must be the ex." Marissa gave a saccharine smile. "Oh, he told you about me." "No," Ava said calmly. but I can smell desperation from a mile away." Marissa blinked, stunned. Then she turned back to Blake. "We should talk. Privately." "There's nothing to talk about," he said. "Really? You're willing to risk your company's reputation over—" This Blake stepped forward, voice quiet but firm. "If you try to hurt her, I will destroy every platform you think you have left." Marissa flinched just slightly, but she knew he meant it. She turned on her heel, disappearing into the crowd of limousines and glittering gowns. Ava exhaled slowly. "That was her, wasn't it?" "Yes," Blake said. "She's the one who threatened you." "I'm sorry." Ava looked up at him. "Well, what happens now, I handle it." A beat. "Do you still want this?" she asked. "Us." His voice didn't waver. "I've never wanted anything more." And this time, she believed him. The morning after the gala, the city sparkled under a blanket of snow. The streets outside Blake Harrison's penthouse were unusually still, almost reverent. But inside, Blake was far from still. He stood in his office, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, pacing. His phone sat on the desk, glowing with a single name on the screen. Reynolds. He answered on the first ring. "She's cornered," Reynolds said. "We've got the leverage." Blake exhaled. "What did you find? Marissa's been shopping rumors about Harrison Technologies to two of your competitors. Claims she has internal intel." Blake's voice tightened. "She doesn't. I know. But perception sells. And she's desperate enough to bluff." Blake moved to the window, staring out at the frozen skyline. "She crossed a line. She's breached a confidentiality clause in her last client's settlement. If we notify their lawyers, she loses everything." Blake finished. Reynolds paused. "You want to do it?" Blake hesitated. Then, yes. And add a clause if she breathes a word about Ava or leaks those photos. She forfeits the rest of her assets. Reynolds didn't ask if Blake was sure. He just said, "Consider it done." That afternoon, Blake left work early. No bodyguards, no drivers, just him. A man with too many regrets and one fragile hope. He took the subway, an unusual choice, and got off at Brooklyn Heights, walking the familiar path toward Ava's building. When she opened the door, her face was unreadable. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again," she said softly. "I wasn't sure either," he replied honestly. "But I knew I had to." He stepped inside, removing his coat. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and ink, her world, still so different from his. She motioned toward the couch. They sat. "I handled it," Blake said, his voice low. "Marissa, the threats. It's over." Ava didn't speak. "I should have told you everything earlier. But I've spent so long being a version of myself that didn't let anyone in. I forgot how to be someone who does." She turned to him. "Finally, do you want to change that I do? Because you want me? Or because you're afraid of losing me?" Blake met her gaze. "Both." A long pause. Then Ava whispered, "I don't want to be a beautiful chapter in someone else's story. I want a life, not a spotlight, not a secret." Blake nodded. "Then let's build one." She looked at him, still unsure, still protecting something fragile inside. Words are easy, Blake, especially from men who've learned to charm boardrooms. I brought actions too. He pulled a manila envelope from his coat. Inside, a contract, a personal endowment to fund Ava's classroom literacy program, not anonymously this time. His name would be on it. Hers too. "It's your work, your dream," he said. "I just want to help it grow." Ava ran her fingers over the papers, silent. "And," Blake added, "I asked the foundation to partner with your school long term. You'll lead the initiative. On your terms." She looked up. Her eyes were wide, damp. You did all this for me? No, he said. For us. That weekend, they spent their first truly quiet day together. No suits, no speeches, no tension, just morning coffee, reading aloud from old children's books, laughter over burnt toast, a walk through a snow-covered park where no one knew their names. It was ordinary, and it was perfect. At one point, Ava paused by a frozen fountain, watching children toss snowballs nearby. I used to come here as a kid, she said. Never thought I'd end up back here, with a man in five-figure shoes. Blake glanced down. Only four figures today. She laughed. Progress. He turned to her, more serious. You still worry you don't belong in my world. Sometimes, she admitted. But maybe that's the wrong question. What's the right one? She smiled. Can we build a world that belongs to both of us? Blake took her hand. Yes, he said. And I think we already are. Back at the penthouse that evening, Blake made dinner badly. Pasta that stuck together. Sauce too salty. But Ava didn't complain. She laughed through all of it, teasing gently, offering advice. When they finally sat down with their mismatched plates, she looked around the massive apartment. Still feels like a museum, she said. He raised an eyebrow. How do we fix that? Pillows, plants, books, maybe some fingerprints on the glass. Noted. And maybe, she hesitated, then added, a picture of us. He froze for a second, then nodded. Yeah, that sounds right. Later that night, curled together on the couch, Blake reached for her hand. I was wrong, he said quietly. Love isn't a risk. She turned to him. No, it's a choice. You choose to risk, to stay, to build. She nodded against his chest. I choose you, he whispered. And for the first time in years, he felt chosen too. 6 months later, the gymnasium of Brooklyn Elementary School buzzed with end-of-year excitement. Streamers fluttered from basketball hoops. Student artwork decorated the walls, and folding chairs filled with proud parents waited for the program to begin. On a small stage near the front, Ava Monroe adjusted the paper microphone one of her second graders had crafted from tinfoil and construction paper. Behind her, 23 children fidgeted in their best clothes, some with crooked ties, some with ribbons too big for their heads. The music started. The kids began to sing. Blake Harrison sat near the back, surrounded by the laughter and squeals of family he wasn't biologically tied to, but now felt connected to by heart. He watched Ava with quiet awe. She was in her element, guiding, encouraging, soft but strong. He'd seen her in a gala gown and in old jeans, in classrooms and boardrooms. But this was her truest self. A little girl with pigtails turned in her seat and whispered, Are you really Miss Monroe's boyfriend? Blake smiled and crouched beside her. I am. Is that okay with you? She squinted at him. You have to be nice. She's the best teacher ever. I know she is, he said solemnly. I pinky promise. She held out her tiny finger. He linked it with his own. By the time the performance ended, half the room was in tears, including Blake. That evening, their apartment now was alive with quiet joy. It was smaller than Blake's penthouse, warmer. Books spilled from every shelf. There were kids' drawings on the fridge and a stack of literacy grant paperwork on the coffee table. Ava was barefoot, dancing slowly in the kitchen as music from an old vinyl played softly. Blake watched her from the doorway, leaning against the frame. She looked up. What just? This. She raised an eyebrow. This life, he said. It's not what I expected, but it's everything I needed. She smiled, walking over to him. You've changed. I hope so. She wrapped her arms around his waist. Not too much. Later that week, they hosted a fundraiser in their home for a citywide literacy initiative Ava had designed. Executives, educators, artists, and friends filled the space. Roberta Langston raised a glass mid-evening to Ava Monroe and Blake Harrison, who reminded us that when heart and power meet purpose, incredible things can happen. As glasses clinked and the hum of conversation resumed, Blake turned to Ava. "I love you," he said. "It wasn't the first time, but it felt like the most important. I think I started falling the night you stood up to that taxi driver," he added with a grin. Ava laughed. "That's when you peaked." He pulled her close. "Then I better keep trying." Outside, snow had begun to fall soft, slow, like it had all those months ago. They stepped onto the balcony, wrapped in a shared coat, fingers entwined. "Do you think this was fate?" Ava asked quietly. Blake considered the city lights below. "Maybe. Or maybe fate just gave us a chance, and we chose to show up." She rested her head on his shoulder. "That's what love is, isn't it? Showing up," he said. "Every day." A gust of wind swept through, and Ava laughed, tugging her scarf tighter. "But if fate was involved," she said, "it did a hell of a job." Blake kissed the top of her head. "Yeah, best deal I ever made." As we grow older, we often choose comfort over risk, predictability over emotion. We tell ourselves we've lived enough, loved enough, hurt enough. But sometimes, life offers us one more invitation to open our hearts. And when it comes, it doesn't always look the way we expect. Blake and Ava's story reminds us that love doesn't care for timing, status, or logic. It cares only for truth, for presence, for the courage to show up not just for others, but for ourselves. No matter our age, we never stop needing connection. And it's never too late to choose something more meaningful than safety intimacy, honesty, and healing. Maybe the lesson isn't about finding someone new, but about becoming someone willing to be seen again. So if there's a call in your life you've been ignoring, be it love, reconciliation, or simply a deeper way of living, perhaps this is the gentle nudge you've been waiting for. Because even in winter, hope finds a way to bloom. Thank you for staying with us through this heartfelt journey. If this story touched something deep within you, reminded you of love, loss, or the quiet strength it takes to begin again, we're truly grateful to have shared it with you. Your presence means more than you know. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. It helps us continue creating stories that heal, connect, and inspire. Until next time, take care and keep believing in the beauty of second chances.